1873 Colfax, Louisiana. A courthouse on the Red River, a disputed election, and a banner that local lore says turned darker than any dye. What unfolded here was not a rumor and not a clash. It was a gruesome lesson, delivered in daylight. A democracy can be throttled, not only by bullets, but by paperwork filed afterward. This is a chapter of Reconstruction memory that many treated as banned effectively, classified by indifference, buried beneath rulings and euphemisms, and kept quiet by people who preferred order to justice. We proceed without gore, without spectacle. The record speaks through affidavits, depositions, docket sheets, ledgers, where men signed their names to peace, while others were left beyond counting. Violence borrowed the language of law. Later, the law, when asked to speak, declared itself powerless. If you have heard this called a riot, the documents whisper a different word. If you imagine surrender, bring safety testimony from this hill will tell you what happened when hands went up and flags came down. Some stories are hidden by fear, others by procedure. Colfax was hidden by both, and the echo still haunts the land. Before smoke drifted over the river, there was routine. Freedmen planting along the bottoms, a minister opening service beneath rough rafters, neighbors reading ballots aloud because not everyone could yet read the print. Since 1868, these families had tried to turn freedom into courthouse, civic order tax rolls, balanced school terms, scheduled levy repairs, prioritized jury lists that finally included black citizens by right rather than exception. A black sheriff, a black militia drilling for defense. A brass bugle once used in war, now calling meetings. These were not provocations, they were citizenship in practice. To those unwilling to accept emancipation as equal citizenship, this normal looked combustible. Newspapers chambered rumors like rounds warning of Negro rule and insurrection. Paramilitary protective clubs marched under the code word order. Night riders audited voter rolls by torchlight. The courthouse meant to hold minutes, and maps became a rampart guarded by men short on ammunition, but not on purpose. Jim Crow had not yet been inked into every statute. But the handwriting was their technicalities that emptied rights juries curated to a foregone conclusion, indictments that crumbled in the humidity of local custom. This is a peaceful parish, some said. It was until a date was set, and writers moved to make the peace permanent on their terms. On that hill, a thin fabric of hope stretched across a powder-keg church picnics after harvest. Children's birthdays penciled into Bibles, a courthouse that might finally belong to everyone. Beneath it all, the charge weighted the macabre arithmetic of a place where ballots could be recast as threats, and where the vocabulary chosen by tomorrow's headline would decide whether yesterday's dead could be named. If you value evidence over euphemism, add your voice below. Should we call Colfax a riot or a massacre? And why do those words matter in law and memory? Tell us where you are watching from and whether your town holds a site where the official story still uses softer language than the witnesses did. No graphic imagery will appear in this film. For disturbing segments, we use records, maps, blurred photographs, and respectful illustrations. Share this episode so that what was once effectively classified does not vanish again in the footnotes. Reconstruction did not arrive in Colfax as a sermon. It arrived as amendment statutes and oaths that had to muscle their way through custom. On paper, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments closed one era and opened another. In practice, they behaved like weather present. Everywhere felt unevenly resisted by habit and interest. Parish officials were elected, and contested newspapers set tones that juries would later carry into deliberation, and the courthouse became the stage on which national principles had to perform with local actors. It is tempting to say that violence was sudden, that people woke to it like an unexpected storm. The record suggests otherwise. It shows a slow choreography of men meetings, rumors, and uniforms legal processes marching alongside paramilitary ones, each claiming to defend order. The word order did heavy work. In editorials and parlor rooms, it meant stability after war, property secure, contracts honored. On levee roads and night patrols, order meant riders' masks and lists of names. Protective clubs formed not in back alleys but in daylight, men who wore business coats on weekdays and cartridge belts on weekends, who learned to speak with both a lawyer's caution and a soldier's economy. Their pamphlets spoke of corruption, Negro misruled tax burdens, and the threat of black jurors. They held that the ballot had been abused by ignorance and manipulation, that the parish would restore a balance. The language is familiar to any student of power, a vocabulary of neutrality that line by line rehearsed exclusion. Opposite this stood black citizens who made citizenship concrete. They petitioned, drilled, and guarded a courthouse, not as revolutionaries, but as men who believed that defense was part of their duty. Many were veterans of the United States colored troops, fluent in the doctrine of pickets' lanes of fire and the etiquette of surrender. Their uniforms were gone, but the discipline remained: watch rotations, ammunition counts, the difference between warning shots and the real thing. They pinned notices, sent letters to state officers, asked for federal protection. The replies were cautious, delayed, or non-existent. Jurisdiction is not a romantic word, but here it becomes a character, a line on a map that decides in the hour of danger how far a promise can travel. Institutions did more than fail to prevent the clash. They prepared its logic. Convict leasing turned arrest into revenue, which meant sheriffs had incentives that had little to do with justice and much to do with balances. Contract disputes over labor blurred into criminal charges when planters needed leverage. Editors used small headlines to shave big facts, preferring disturbance to assault, excess to execution. In courts, indictments foundered on technicalities, a missing seal, a misphrased clause, a jurisdictional hedge. These were not accidents. They were a grammar of evasion, a set of habits that would later allow the word riot to swallow the word massacre in the public memory. At the margins of the record lie the disturbing details that history often files as local color, but which in moments like this read like omens. Horses shod backward to confuse trackers. A lantern hung too high on a cotton shed signal, or mistake no one could agree. A ferry that ran late 3 nights in a row, then did not run at all. A deputy who spoke softly of caution in the general store, and then was seen in a different company at a different hour. A deacon's wife who told the younger women to move their children to the church basement for a few days because God speaks in patterns. None of this is mystical, and yet together it forms the cadence of a final warning, ignored because it did not wear a uniform or a seal. Churches became both shelter and committee rooms. Pastors balanced psalms of refuge with announcements about watch shifts. Bibles in pew racks shared space with folded notices what to do if riders came where to gather, if the courthouse was threatened. In one congregation, a battered bugle salvaged from a Union camp years earlier summoned men to meetings. Its note, once a call to charge, now meant sit, listen, and plan a civic sound, not a martial one. Families brought food to the courthouse yard, bread, beans, water jugs, insisting that vigilance would not cancel ordinary care. This was not a community courting war. It was a community refusing to be erased between one election and the next. Across the river and along the parish lines, different preparations went forward. Firearms were cleaned on porches. Ammunition came in wagons that pretended to be bound for hunting trips. Letters promised retaking and settling. Men tallied who among them had served in Confederate commands and which of the black defenders had been soldiers, calculations of pride and resentment that would later harden into a roster of targets. The riders called what they were doing a march for order. The maps they drew, fords, fields, fences, looked suspiciously like battle plans. The press rehearsed the story before it happened. Editorials warned of insurrection at the courthouse, while studiously ignoring the open musters gathering miles away. When black leaders petitioned for protection, columns called them alarmist. When white notables hinted at a retaking, columns called them concerned citizens. If you read enough of these pieces in sequence, you hear the sentence forming a future headline, selecting the word riot, the single syllable that would make everything symmetrical and therefore tolerable. A riot implies two sides in equal folly. It does not admit the unspeakable, that one side might surrender and die anyway. Amid the rhetoric, the law tutored itself toward absence. Prosecutors learned the limits of the enforcement acts. Judges trained their eyes to see state action and to go blind at private conspiracy. The distinction would later become doctrinal in a courtroom far from Colfax, but on the ground, it was already practice. Deputies arrived late or not at all. Sheriffs insisted on paperwork that could not be produced while men were defending a building, and jurors were drawn from pools that ensured one result while permitting another. It was, in the cool phrase of lawyers, a question of remedies. A right without a remedy is not a right. It is a rumor that can be broken by the first hard knock on a door. The community read the signals. Some families left for a time up the river to cousins. Others stayed unwilling to surrender harvests or houses to fear. Those who remained shifted from daily routines to alert routines. Children learned to sleep on pallets away from windows. Women coached each other on where to hide documents, marriage certificates, land deeds, school lists in case the house was searched or burned. Men moved ledgers and meeting minutes into the courthouse itself, believing, perhaps naively, that a public building conferred a kind of safety. It is one of the crueler ironies of Colfax, the belief that law is safest in the house of law. If there is a macabre aura around what follows, it is not because of superstition. It is because the components of tragedy aligned with mechanical precision, language, doctrine, habit, arms, so that when the first shot came, the outcome felt foreclosed. The banned quality of this episode, what makes it feel classified to later generations, is not only the brutality that ensued, but the bureaucratic calm that would later describe it. The erasure was prepared before the bodies fell. The euphemisms were arranged on the page before the ink dried on depositions. On the eve of the final confrontation, Colfax was quiet enough to hear the river. There were prayers in homes where lamps were turned low, and there were boasts on porches where oil burned late. In one house, a mother stitched a child's name into a sleeve so he could be found if the worst happened, an act of love that doubles as a ledger. Entry, a refusal to let a life be miscounted. In another, a man wrapped a folded letter, unposted address, half written around a small brass button from his uniform, then slid both into a Bible. That is how faith behaves in a season of procedural doubt. It preserves names against the possibility that the law will not. By then, riders had chosen their routes and the defenders their posts. The courthouse held minutes maps and a hope that official paper could resist unofficial force. The parish held its breath, and the oaths, federal, state, and local, stood at their invisible borders, waiting to see which would cross first, the men with rifles or the promises written for a nation learning too slowly how to keep them. Dawn did not so much break over Colfax as arrive with the sound of metal, a rattle of cartridge boxes, the blunt clack of hammers drawn back, and somewhere along the river road, a wagon board flexing under weight. The courthouse hill, which had been a diagram of anxieties the night before, became a diagram of fields of fire. Black defenders took up positions, windows, fence lines, a shallow trench scratched in hard ground. The courthouse itself, meant for minutes and ledgers, turned into a last resort, not because men wanted a fort, but because a law that would not walk the parish had to be sheltered in a building. Across the open ground, white columns cohered hunters in weekday coats, veterans who had learned to dress respectably around a rifle boys, whose first muster was this one. They advanced in bounds using the low-rise and a cluster of trees as a partial screen. Someone called for parley. Someone else shouted it down. The first exchange was brief and inconclusive, like the throat clearing before a verdict. Then the tempo changed. Reports cracked from the tree line, windows answered, splinters jumped from door frames. A stray shot struck the courthouse roofline. Another nicked a post where a notice of school terms had been tacked just days before. Smoke wore the building like a shawl. Some said a thrown ember landed on a sash. Others swore a shell burst in a stairwell. Still others insisted that the defenders, desperate, started a diversion that turned on them. The record is not unanimous. What is consistent is the pressure men inside counting rounds. Men outside counting yards, both sides taking casualties that the newspapers would later translate into euphemisms. Women and children had already gone escorted away at first light by men too old to fight and boys too young to hold a line. The hill shrank to the size of the men who remained. A brass bugle, dented and no longer true to pitch, sounded from a side room. It did not call a charge, it called a decision. Ammunition was low. The lines had been driven inward until they touched the courthouse walls. Through the smoke, a white square shirt-cloth torn ledger page rose on a stick. Hands followed. Voices traveled, "We surrender." Surrender is not a metaphor. It is a legal condition recognized in soldiers' law and moral law alike. In Colfax on that day, surrender ran into a word that had already been chosen to replace it: riot. What should have followed detention, disarmament, a march under guard, fractured. Some men were collected in small groups and moved down slope. Others were forced to lie where burned boards still smoldered. There are testimonies that speak of men shot while pleading. There are depositions thin spare that report the collapse of a line of prisoners under a point-blank volley. The language strains here because years later, appellate prose would not carry it. Editors wrote excesses. Clerks wrote fatalities. The people who watched from the levee used plainer terms and then fell silent because plainness was expensive. A few defenders broke from the yard in the confusion and ran for the river cane. Some were cut down in pursuit. Others, wounded, were found later by friends who followed a trail of flattened grass. And no, we will not say it what the camera will not show. A messenger who had been sent earlier to beg for intervention doubled back and arrived in time to find the hill quiet and the yard changed into arithmetic. He would sign a statement weeks later that said too little because he had to keep living among men who had said too much with their guns. A deacon hiding in a ditch heard a voice he recognized give an order. He never spoke the name aloud in public again. The defenders' banner party colors more than war colors had fallen. In the telling that took root, later, cloth became witness. The bloody flag is both rumor and relic, a piece of fabric that lore claims turned darker than any dye. It may have existed. A fragment may still exist, tucked in a trunk or swallowed by mildew. It may have been imagined because the documents were so cold. Either way, the flag entered memory as the macabre shorthand for what official language could not admit that men with hands raised were killed after surrender. Objects gather meaning when institutions shed it. By late afternoon, the hill was held by men who called themselves restorers of order. They sent word that the disturbance had been quelled. They took stock not of the dead, but of who among them had been nicked, scorched, deafened for an hour by their own volleys. Some, sobered by what they had done, rode home in silence. Others rehearsed talking points for the editor who would nudge their statements into the passive voice. Night came unmistakable and unadorned. There were fires burned to ash in the yard and lamps lit low in houses where women waited for men who did not return. The morning after began the second movement of Colfax, the one that many documentaries rush past because it is bureaucratic and therefore easy to ignore. It is also where the erasure starts. Bodies were collected incompletely. Names were gathered unevenly. Families moved carefully, asking quietly, identifying at a distance. A few white notables insisted on respect for the dead, even as they refused the word that would have named the manner of dying. A justice of the peace scribbled something that looked like a report. A sheriff argued that certain procedures could not be followed because certain forms had not been filed. It is difficult to describe how disturbing a shrug can be when it stands in the place where law should stand. Then came affidavits. Black survivors, those who could, those who dared, swore to what they had seen. The approach to the fire, the surrender, the shots at close range. A midwife wrote a statement about a man she had bandaged on the river path. A steamboat deckhand described hearing volleys while his captain insisted the boat keep to midstream. 2 white men, shaken, reported that things went too far. Their testimony would be cited and then diluted until it served as proof of moderation rather than of murder. This is the grammar of later redemption: find the smallest admission and use it to erase the larger fact. Indictments did follow. Federal officers, slow, scattered, and stubborn, took names and swore out charges under the Enforcement Acts. The theory was simple. The rights guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments must mean protection against conspiracies that sought to strip them by force. The practice was crueler. The law, as written, required precise words about state action that federal prosecutors walking new ground did not always place in the right clauses. Grand juries produced papers that looked like justice on their covers. Trials convened. Witnesses traveled under escort and slept in rooms where the window lock had been tested before they arrived. Convictions came narrow, fragile, like glass figures on a shelf that the slightest tremor could shatter. Defense counsel, some of them. Veterans, in another sense, filed motions that turned on phrases whether the right to assemble was a national privilege enforceable by federal criminal law, whether the counts properly alleged conspiracies with the necessary ingredients, whether, in short, the United States could touch what had happened on that hill if the state chose not to. Appeals rose. The classified feeling of Colfax takes shape precisely here, in the momentum of paper moving away from the scene, until the scene becomes a footnote to the paper. While lawyers fenced, the parish taught itself to speak unison. The newspapers settled on the word riot. It appeared in headlines, then in resolutions, then on a monument. Riot makes symmetrical what was not. It redraws the yard into a diagram with arrows on both sides and wipes away the moment when the arrows stopped, hands lifted, and the bullets did not. Riot also comforts equal foolishness, equal blame, a wash of neutrality over the unspeakable. The community that lost sons and fathers held a different ceremony. Names were spoken in kitchens and under trees, not etched on plaques. A mother folded a sleeve with a stitched initial and put it away where a sheriff's warrant would not find it. From Washington, far from the Red River, came the sound of doctrine arranging itself. A Supreme Court term would eventually issue a decision that treated the 14th Amendment as a barrier only to governments, not to private conspiracies left unpunished by those governments. We will reach that chamber in the next chapter. For now it is enough to see how the road runs there, a record swollen with facts and starved of the particular phrasing courts required. A jury pool curated, a verdict set aside. A community told that the solemn promises of the nation had been written with invisible ink, the color of state indifference. The gruesome core of Colfax is not only the killing, it is the choreography by which the killing was renamed and then the renaming was ratified. It is the way a surrender could be made to vanish inside the single syllable of riot, and how that syllable traveled better than in any affidavit across desks where men preferred to balance doctrine rather than name a crime. It is also the truth that no one talks about comfortably, that the erasure did not require a bonfire of records. It required only a preference for symmetry and a willingness to let the law blink at the moment it was needed. Before we leave the hill for the courtroom, fix these images without showing what cannot be shown: the white cloth raised from a window, the bugle note that meant enough, the slow walk of men with hands high, the pause, the volley. Fix, too, the after-image that the camera will treat with restraint, a ledger moved from a desk to a hidden place because the page had been signed by a man who would not be present the next Sunday. The next chapter will trace how those pages' statutes, counts opinions, stacked into a barrier taller than any man on the hill, and how a nation learned to call that barrier precedent. Morning receded from the hill and flowed into offices where law keeps its furniture, the clerk's desk, the docket cabinet, the shelf of reporters bound in sober cloth. Colfax, which had been noise and smoke, became paper. Deputies took statements. Federal officers, late but persistent, gathered names. The hill's geometry, who stood where, who waved a cloth, who fired and who did not, was translated into affidavits with margins and seals. To watch this translation is to see how memory gets negotiated. Blunt verbs soften distances, guessed moments that witnesses swear were minutes reduced to lines that fit the form. We keep our promise: no gore, no spectacle. We show ledgers, not the wounds behind them. We show a coroner's blank where a signature should be. A page that notes deceased identified by kin, then leaves the next line empty because fear outlived courage in the courthouse corridor. The macabre revelation is not a photograph. It is the distance between events and the language available to describe them. Official tallies kept modest company with the day's reality. The community's count was larger and spoken softly. A midwife's note, a minister's list, a folded page found years later in a Bible evidence that breathes outside the courtroom, even when the courtroom declines to inhale. Indictments followed under the Enforcement Acts, a federal attempt to graft remedy onto right. The theory was straightforward. If the Constitution guarantees equal protection and the vote free of racial bar, then conspiracy to strip those guarantees by force is a federal crime. The practice required precision that history had not taught anyone to wield under pressure. Counts had to be phrased to capture not just violence, but the particular jurisdictional hook, what lawyers called state action. Prosecutors alleged conspiracy against rights. Defense counsel alleged overreach. Trials convened in rooms where ceiling fans turned slowly, and the law's grand promises crowded the air like a sermon that some in the pews had no intention to hear. Verdicts came narrow, precarious. Defense counsel rose with seasoned calm. They did not deny the dead. They denied the reach. The United States, they argued, was not a roving policeman for every private crime. The amendments, they said, struck at governments, not citizens acting as mobs. If the state failed to punish that failure, was local dereliction, not a federal invitation. It is a disturbing position. Precisely because of its elegance, it offers a way to acknowledge tragedy while denying remedy. It is the shape of a shrug rendered in doctrine. Appeals climb the ladder that distance builds between a scene and its judgment. At the top rung in 1876, the Supreme Court decided United States v. Cruikshank. The opinion held that the 14th Amendment restrained states, not private conspirators. That the federal charges, as written, did not properly allege the necessary involvement of state authority. That the rights invoked, assembly bearing arms, were not yet configured as national privileges enforceable by these particular criminal counts. The convictions fell away like ash from a burned page. The ruling did not say the Hill was innocent. It said the statutes did not reach it. In practice, the message was simpler: if the state will not act, the United States cannot at least not like this. Return now to the courthouse yard, but through the lens of that decision. Surrender, which is a moral and military category, met a legal architecture that refused to see what had happened as something the nation could punish. Private action, the court said. Local matter. The federal government's hands, raised like the defenders' hands, were declared empty by design. In the years that followed, men who studied the law learned a lesson that would travel faster than any posse: keep violence unofficial, keep the badges off stage, and you can carve out a banned zone where rights exist as text and evaporate as remedy. The press helped. Headline writers settled on riot, that tidy word that suggests symmetry and mutual folly. Monuments, when they came, preferred the sculpture of neutrality. Peace restored disturbances, quelled order, returned. A plaque is not a court, but it can function as a closing argument read by generations. If it will not say massacre, the ground must continue to speak in other ways. Family lists recited in kitchens, sermons that never mention the hill while everyone knows which hill the preacher means. A school teacher pointing to a blank paragraph in the parish history and telling students to write what belongs there. Meanwhile, the macabre evidence persisted not as a gallery, but as a filing system, letters pleading for protection, stamped received after the date. A telegraph note about a line down on Sunday and repaired on Monday. A sheriff's return that lists a warrant served on a man who could not have answered because the river already knew his name. These are not graphic. They are anatomical, showing the bones of erasure. The body of truth is often hidden in the joints of procedure. Why was Colfax buried? Because acknowledging it would indict the machinery that framed itself as neutral. Motive was political consolidating. White democratic control required a narrative in which black civic assertion was inherently combustible. Economics demanded labor governed by fear contracts, enforced by the possibility of violence and the certainty of impunity. Culture feared inversion, that emancipation might mean not equality, but reversal. The mechanism of burial was lexical and legal substitute riot for massacre classified by euphemism. Prefer state inaction to federal action, cultivate a jurisprudence that treats private terror as air rather than weather. The repetition came quickly. Parishes and counties took notes. If Colfax could be converted from an execution after surrender into a disturbance, then other places could manage their narratives the same way. Redemption became a political program with a procedural toolkit: control the jury lists, police the affidavits, litigate the verbs. Violence was not always necessary. The memory of it, coupled with the knowledge that courts would parse the wrong clause, was often enough. In that sense, Colfax was not simply an event. It was a manual. Yet manuals can be annotated. Descendants and scholars returned to the records counted again. Named again, reread Cruikshank not as absolution, but as a technical chapter with devastating implications. They petitioned for plaques that say the unsaid word for textbooks, that print the unprinted numbers for tours that stand on the hill, and explain what surrender means in moral law, even when a court cannot see it. In archives, someone unfolded a letter that began "Sir" and recognized in its creases the shape of a hope that had not entirely flattened. We close this chapter with images that do not wound the eye, but instruct it the courthouse minute book with pages missing during the exact months that matter. A jury list that contains no surnames from the northern half of the parish where the black vote was strongest. A newspaper that uses order 3 times in one paragraph. And held lightly the fabric that local lore calls the bloody flag, treated here as symbol and question. Whether cloth or story, it carries the weight of testimony that could not find purchase in a courtroom. The next step is not to fetishize the object, but to read why a community needed an object at all. When institutions refuse to pronounce the truth, artifacts and voices do it anyway. Colfax's legacy is not a ghost story. It is a civics lesson written with consequences. A right without a remedy is a rumor. A verdict that tells a community it's dead belonged to the category of private teaches that community how to speak in code and how to remember in defiance. Precedent once set lives a long time. So does the counter-precedent of people who refuse to let the ledger stay clean. The hill at Colfax is quiet now. Grass folds in the slightest wind. The Red River moves without comment. A courthouse stands altered by time, dedicated to functions that presume stability. People park, pay fines, register deeds. Normal business cloaks a place where once the vocabulary of law failed, the grammar of justice. Memory has a way of choosing what to keep in public and what to keep inside a house. Colfax teaches that both choices are political. The decades after 1873 wrote consequences into daily life. Black schools learned to do more with less, and to call survival success. Church ledgers marked baptisms and burials on the same page because the community could not afford separate books. Credit lines tightened for families who insisted on their rights in court. Jury lists reverted toward a sameness that told applicants at the door what verdicts were likely before the first oath was sworn. The riot plaque, where it existed, worked like an algorithm. It returned the same answer regardless of the query. When language is engineered to avoid a fact, the fact becomes homework for the next generation. But memory did not end at the plaque. It traveled in stories told softly on porches at dusk, in letters folded into Bibles, in a child-stitched initials saved in a drawer for the day when someone would ask, "Who was he?" Teachers who could not assign a chapter. Assigned a walk, go stand on the hill, bring back a sentence that names what the plaque will not. Ministers who would not say, Colfax from the pulpit preached Psalm 10. Why do you stand far off? And everyone in the pews knew the geography. Veterans of later wars returned home and realized that a flag can be respected or it can be referenced to excuse silence. The difference is whether the living will say the names of the dead. Law evolved, inching toward remedies that Reconstruction could not hold. New statutes, new cases, new prosecutions, none of them retroactive, none of them restorative in the full sense, but proof that doctrine can be amended, that categories can be widened to see what they missed. Yet the lesson of United States v. Cruikshank endures like an old scar if the state will not act. And if the nation arranges its vision to stop at the state line, private terror learns how to shade itself just enough to live in the blind. Colfax is not an antique. It is a template until we deliberately make it a caution. There is a temptation in the final minutes of a film to demand catharsis, a confession discovered in a trunk. A single photograph that settles the number. A courtroom that reconvenes to correct itself. We do not have that posture here. What we have is the harder thing: work and will. Work to correct archives, to label the event with its accurate name, to place the number within a range that accounts for the dead. No ledger dared count to publish school materials that refuse euphemism. Will to stand in public where private sorrow has stood alone and say this was a massacre. The surrender was real, the erasure was procedural, the legacy is measurable. So we return one last time to the bloody flag cloth or symbol. We treat it not as a relic to be worshipped, but as a question you must answer. Why did a community need fabric to say what affidavits could not? Because institutions trained themselves to hear only certain frequencies. Because a courtroom miles away perfected a distinction between public and private that in practice was a distinction between remedy and none. Because the nation told itself that local matter is a neutral phrase, when history shows it is often a velvet rope for impunity. What would justice look like now? Not spectacle, not borrowed rage. Justice begins with correct words on the site itself, with county histories that devote pages, not footnotes, with family names restored to the story, with a parish budget that treats preservation as obligation, not ornament. It looks like educators who are trusted to teach Reconstruction as a living civics lesson instead of a brief intermission between wars. It looks like state officials saying aloud what their predecessors would not, that the law failed in 1873, and that failure trained later failures. And it looks like citizens us accepting a final discipline to resist the lazy symmetry of the word riot, to ask what remedies our own doctrines would withhold, to pay attention when euphemism returns wearing a new suit. The past is not prologued by fate. It is prologued by choice. Colfax's afterlife depends on which sentences we repeat. We promised no graphic images, and we have kept that promise. Instead, we have held on screen the anatomy of erasure, missing signatures, careful headlines, verdicts that could not see a surrendered man as a federal concern. If this felt macabre, it is because nothing is more chilling than a system that declares itself neutral at the exact moment neutrality is a verdict. The echo from 1873 still haunts the land, not as a ghost, but as a policy. Our last image is plain. Present day. The sun lowers over Grant Parish. A small group stands where the yard once filled with smoke. Someone reads names. Someone else adds the phrase that alters the air killed after surrender. There is no music, only river noise and paper moving in a hand. The camera holds the plaque, whatever it says now, and then lifts just enough to include the horizon. The frame is an invitation and a test. Tell us in the comments the word your town uses, where the truth is harder. If you grew up with a marker that says disturbance, tell us the moment you learned what happened had another name. If you're watching from a place that has never named its hill, say what would have to change for that to happen. Share this film if you believe that evidence should outlive euphemism and that rights should be more than rumors waiting for a remedy. Colfax is over only if we let the ledger stay clean.